Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Polina Boiko, and today we're talking about sexism in sport. Over the course of the London Olympic Games, 4,847 women will have taken part in the Games. Never before will every competing nation have been represented by at least one female athlete. On one hand, inside the Games, equality is closer than ever. Back in 1900, the first 22 women out of a total of 997 athletes took part. As recently as in 1984, at the Los Angeles Games, the number of women involved remained less than a quarter. 4 years ago in Beijing, it was 43%, and in London, it's going to be 44%. So should we be celebrating how far women in sport have come, or lamenting the fact that there's still so much further that they could go? Female athletes are still speaking publicly about the pressures faced by women in sport. Women's sports command a fraction of the sponsorship or the media attention that men's sports do. There have also been allegations of mediocre male teams, such as the Japanese football team and the Australian basketball team, flying business class, while their female counterparts make do with economy. Britain is a particularly strong example of female athletes falling under the radar. There are some truly top-class sportswomen in the UK, world champion swimmers, triathletes and cyclists, and a rugby team that's won the Six Nations title for the past 7 years running. But it's the less successful men who often hog the sponsorship deals and the glory, while female champions go unrecognised. But if women's sport commands less attention, should the rewards for women be the same as for men? And if the situation is unfair, who should we blame? The media, the sponsors, or the way in which society doesn't raise women to want to do sport as much as men want to? To discuss the pressures and the prejudices faced by women in sport, I'm joined in the studio by Tim Woodhouse, Head of Policy at the Women's Sport and Fitness Foundation, Mike Buchanan from the Anti-Feminism League, and over the telephone we have Professor Mary Evans from the London School of Economics Gender Institute. Thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Just to begin with, cyclist Lizzie Armitstead, who won a silver Olympic medal for Sunday's 87-mile road race, took the opportunity to take a public stand against the sexism in sport. She said that the pressures faced by women in sport are very disheartening. Tim, is this a sign that women still face massive hurdles, do you think?
We do think they do face massive hurdles. You're right in your introduction to point out that we've come a long way in the 116 years since the modern Olympics began. We've got women from every country, with the introduction of female athletes from Saudi Arabia this time. Every country is represented by a woman, and women are competing in every sport with the introduction of women's boxing for the first time in London 2012. But we do have a long way to go in other areas. Media profile and commercial sponsorship are two of the areas that Lizzie highlighted. And we do have a real issue there. Outside of the Olympic Games, which obviously does shine a light on women's sport, outside of the Olympics, women's sport only receives less than 5% of media coverage and less than 1% of commercial investment into sport.
Mike, what do you think about Lizzie's stand about sexism?
Well, I think women complain of sexism and they talk of fairness and equality. But what they're always after, always, in sport and in other fields, is equal reward for unequal effort. So if we take Lizzie's particular sport, the men's equivalent lasted 35% longer, and in terms of distance was more than that. Pardon me. And in the road race, the men cycled for 60% longer. It's the Wimbledon factor, if you like. It's women wanting the same money, but making a great deal less effort.
Professor Evans, what do you think about that?
I actually don't see that at all. I think that if you look at quite a lot of sports, the effort is more or less identical. There are certain situations where it's different, but I don't think different should necessarily mean that there should be different rewards. I think a lot of the problems about women in sport are related to issues about women's agency. Doing well in sport, like everything else, really demands that people should go for it, should do their very, very best. And to a certain extent, I'm not sure that women necessarily get the kind of encouragement that actually leads them to be able to make that kind of effort and indeed investment. People invest in things when they think they're going to get rewarded. And obviously the points that you made about sponsorship and so on are very important in that kind of issue.
Mike?
Yes, can I just make another point on effort? If we go back to Wimbledon, the women's game is so undemanding that they often manage to fit in a doubles game on the same day as a singles match. That would be utterly inconceivable in the men's game in the modern era.
I disagree with that. I think there's lots of examples of men playing singles and doubles matches in the modern era. Just this week, we're seeing Andy Murray do just that at the London Games. I think the Wimbledon issue is an interesting one. Sport is not like a factory where you get rewarded for making things or being at work for a longer time. I think the whole 3 sets, 5 sets issue is a bit like saying Tiger Woods should get less prize money because he hit fewer golf shots during a round despite the fact that he won the course. Sport doesn't work as you get paid per unit.
If it boils down to money, money makes the world go round, and we're talking about how many spectators are drawn to the game. If we're talking about tennis or Wimbledon, if the female final attracts smaller audiences, should they be getting paid as much as the male players? Is it a question of money?
I think if you believe in free market economies, as I certainly do, then I think it should be reflecting audience numbers. So if you take sponsorship, for example, I know one of the complaints is that there's not enough sponsorship money. But at the end of the day, the number of men who spectate and are actively involved in the major sports hugely outnumbers the number of women. So why should a company like Adidas or Nike spend a great deal of money on sponsoring women when they clearly, they might do it for public relations reasons, but they wouldn't do it for commercial reasons.
Are we arguing over what came first, the chicken or the egg? Because if there was more sponsorship and more media coverage, perhaps there'd be a bigger interest. And it's not like there isn't an interest, because the recent Women's Football World Cup was very tweeted, and there was the viewing figures were very high. 3.2 million people in the UK watched the Women's World Cup quarter-final. Yet, as you mentioned, something like 5% of overall media coverage, sports media coverage, goes to women in sport.
But that's an exceptional event, and this always happens in these arenas. People take something that is exceptional, and that, if you like, feeds the women's case. But the reality, if you look at, I don't know, even if you just restrict yourself to Premier League and men's football and women's football, the match attendances are just so vastly higher in the men's game.
I think Mike does have a slight point, but what it comes down to is actually media coverage does drive demand, and we know that when the audience are given the chance to watch these exceptional matches, then they do follow. Mike's point about the run-of-the-mill Women's Premier League not being of a good enough quality to command the same audiences is absolutely true. The history of the women's football in this country is much, much smaller. So the investment into coaching, skill-based training is taking its time to work through. And I don't think anyone, certainly from our organisation or anyone in the sports sector, is arguing that Women's Premier League football should be paid the same amount of money as Wayne Rooney or his male equivalents. But there does need to be a regular commitment from broadcasters and journalists to cover the very best of women's sport in order to drive up the following from viewers and from readers, so they are more aware of what's going on and then are more likely to go down to their local club and give it support in that way. So no one's arguing for straight equality straight away. It's a progression.
Yet there were no women in the BBC's shortlist for Sports Personality of the Year last year. Professor Evans, who do you think is to blame in this situation?
I suppose the people choosing the candidates. It's like any other sort of situation in which a prize is being given. The first place to look is who's choosing the candidates for the prize. I would actually like to make 2 points in relationship to the previous discussion. One is that I do think there's an enormous amount of work to be done in terms of normalising the idea that sport is for women as much as it is for men. I think there's a very, very powerful tradition which suggests that men do sport and women perhaps play games on the sidelines. So sport and playing games are, in a sense, two kinds of different places in which people take different sorts of physical activity. The second thing that I would want to say about it, I think, is that in talking about audiences for sport, one of the things that I think is extremely important to mention here is that if you're going to be an audience for a sporting event, you need the time to do it. And a lot of men have a much greater command of free time in the sense that caring responsibilities for children, for elderly people, for all sorts of other things are not equally distributed. So when you're talking about audiences, you have to look at, okay, who's got the time, the money to have that, to be in an audience? I mean, I don't think these things are gender neutral. I think, as in every other part of social life, these are very, very gendered contexts, and we have to look at who is able to do what in any of these particular situations.
Mike?
Yes, I'd like to come there. Again, this is another example of using something, to distort the debate. So yes, of course, more women than men have caring responsibilities. But the idea that, well, for a start, there's a great many women who don't have caring responsibilities. But it's almost making the implication that if they weren't looking after their mother or their children, they'd be out playing football. And I just don't think that's the case.
But they might be going, if they're not playing it, they might be going to look at it. And you've actually got to create a sense in which you have an interest in a particular sport before you're going to play it, before you're going to take part in it, before you're going to actually make the decision, which involves you thinking, right, I could also be really good at this. So I'm going to go that little bit further than just, for example, playing it with my friends, playing it on a kind of casual basis. And I think there's a progression here which has to be built up. And lots and lots of people, lots of men and indeed women who've gone into serious sport have spoken about the way in which they've been helped, encouraged by their parents in various kinds of ways. And it's that kind of connection to sport which I think is extremely important here. Is there a sporting tradition in a school, in a family, in a community, which actually engages people in taking part in these activities? Because it's that initial taking part which I think is something that we have to look at, and we have to look at how that taking part is actually gendered.
Just to remind you, you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Polina Boiko, and today we're talking about sexism in sport. I'm joined in the studio by Tim Woodhouse, Head of Policy at the Women's Sport and Fitness Foundation, Mike Buchanan from the Anti-Feminism League, and over the telephone we have Professor Mary Evans from the London School of Economics Gender Institute. Now, I wanted to take a look at the question of how many women are going into sport nowadays. I wanted to ask Tim, are fewer women going into sport because of the perceived obstacles nowadays and the pressure on girls in sport and the rather unsavory comments made by journalists, Twitter? Is that something that's really affecting the number of women going into professional sport?
I think, thankfully, the number of specific and direct discriminatory remarks in sport, although they absolutely still exist, they have come down. And I don't think that is what's putting off girls from participating in sport. I think it relates much more back to Mary's point, that the way the sport is delivered in school and the importance that sport and physical activity is given to girls in the home environment has a much more impactful effect on girls growing up. The fact that they don't see women playing sport in the media, the fact that a lot of boys seek recognition through sport in ways that girls don't, that all kind of leads to many girls thinking, actually, sport's not for me. I must be slightly strange if I want to do it. So internal pressure and then peer pressure at school means that a lot of girls are dropping out, when actually the boys that have the same level of interest feel that it's normal to be involved in sport, so carry on.
And it's a vicious cycle again, because one of your surveys came up with the figure that 61% of girls surveyed agreed that watching successful sports stars inspired them to get involved. And if we've got no examples of successful female sports stars, or they're much less prominent in the media, then are we likely to get involved?
I think that's absolutely right. And this is why the Olympics are so important for women's sport, because the window of spotlight really only opens up every 4 years. Throughout the other 3.5 years, there's very, very difficult to find women's sport, to get inspired by it. So the Olympics are so important. Actually, one thing that is a ray of hope is that the advance of social media and digital media allows women and women involved in sport to create their own content, which is being lapped up by the public in much higher numbers than the traditional media outlets are giving. So I think that's a real business case example to say that when the content is available, people want to see it, and I think that's a really important opportunity for women's sport going forwards.
Mike?
Yes, I'd just like to make the point that in general, in life, I think we see that men are simply more naturally competitive. They enjoy rules-based competition. They sort of rise to it, if you like. And so we really have to expect that men's interest in sport, in both spectating and playing it, will always be substantially above women's. I mean, men and women are different, and so I mean, I think this is an engineered problem.
But we've got more female team members in Team USA and Team Canada this year, not quite in Team GB. I'm still wondering whether it's something about the pressures faced in the media, because Professor Evans, do you think that women get fairly treated in the media? We've just had, in 2009 Mock of the Week, Frankie Boyle said that Rebecca Adlington looks like someone looking at themselves in the back of a spoon. These are the sort of comments that we sort of laugh at, but it's very, very hurtful, and especially for young girls to be, treated this way. An Australian swimmer has just been called fat, in fact, by a fellow female journalist. So is it something to do with this?
I think I think all these comments that you cite, I haven't seen them, and they seem to me to be very petty and range from sort of petty and vicious to more comprehensively vicious. But it's about participating, I think, in public life. Once you do that, and sport, after all, is part of public life, there's a sense in which, okay, the media gaze is going to be upon you, it's going to look at you, it's going to sort of assess you in various ways, which, again, are gendered. I mean, think about the ways in which female politicians are described, and they're described in different ways to the ways in which male politicians are described. I don't think this is anything that's particular to men and women in sport. I think it's actually about how we look at people in public life. And we actually have to think about that in relationship to sport, certainly. But I really don't think it's a particular problem. I think it's part of a much more general one.
Mike?
Yes, again, it's being selective. I think if we look at public life, I mean, John Prescott, good grief, has there ever been a human being on the planet that had more criticism for his personal appearance than John Prescott? I think he got more than all the female MPs combined. And if we restrict ourselves to sport for the moment, I mean, Andy Murray has been described as being a little bit challenged in the attractiveness stakes, but I'm guessing wildly he doesn't lose sleep over it, and he's got a very attractive girlfriend. So, really, again, it's an engineered problem.
I think the issue of remarks such as those come up so rarely, and the public outcry when they do happen, they get vilified so quickly. We saw last year Richard Keys and Andy Gray lose their jobs on Sky Sports for outrageously sexist comments. And that, I think, is a sign of progress, that society is not prepared to put up with that outright discrimination and sexism. However, it's the more low-lying, hard-to-notice sexism and discrimination that actually probably has the deeper impact.
What about the Olympic Committee? Because they've been in discussions with the International Judo Federation about whether or not the Saudi Arabian judoka can wear a headscarf. Is the IOC correct in allowing Saudi Arabia to take part in the Olympics? or, albeit with these restrictive measures for the women, or should they be doing more? How happy are you with their behaviour?
It's an issue that we've been lobbying on at the Women's Sport and Fitness Foundation for the last 2 or 3 years, and so we are delighted actually that the 2 Saudi women are competing at the Games. However, although it's a symbolic moment, we know that it can't stop there, and actually the barriers to participation in sport and physical activity, which is so important for health reasons, the barriers faced by women and girls in Saudi Arabia far outweigh the momentum that's been gained by having these 2 women compete at the Games. And we really need the IOC to put on much more pressure into the Saudi regime to ensure that the ban on women taking part in physical activity in state schools, for instance, is removed, because that has such long-lasting health issues that actually 2 women competing at the Games, while it's a great start, doesn't go nearly far enough.
Professor Evans, do you think the International Olympic Committee is doing enough?
I think it's walking a very fine line. I mean, I completely agree with the previous comments. I think there's a symbolic importance about 2 women from Saudi Arabia taking part, but it doesn't actually deal with the total exclusion of half the population of that country from sport or indeed public life. So I think it's important. It can be seen as in terms of, well, if 2 people did it, why can't more people do it? But I think the Olympic Committee has to, I think, is very clearly aware that there's a huge political problem about the issue of the ways in which gender relations are organised in Saudi Arabia. And it doesn't want to put itself into the situation of condemning a particular country or a particular set of social practices. But on the other hand, I think it has to make very, very clear that taking part in sport is a right, is a general human right, and I would like to see them reiterate that much more loudly.
Just to remind you, you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Polina Boiko, and today we're discussing sexism in sport. To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Tim Woodhouse, Head of Policy at the Women's Sport and Fitness Foundation, Mike Buchanan from the Anti-Feminism League, and over the telephone we have Professor Mary Evans from the London School of Economics Gender Institute. Okay, so if we're talking about sexism in sport, what's the recipe? What can we do to improve the situation? Whose responsibility is it to make things better? And if we've spoken a little bit, we've touched upon sponsorship. How big a deal is money in this situation, and how big a role do sponsors play?
It differs in every sport. The male football stars, the differential between what the men earn playing football and what the women do is ridiculous. The top women players will receive about £50,000 a year, but to get that you have to be playing for England regularly, whereas obviously a lot of the men stars earn that in a week. And now obviously, I've said it before, we're not asking for those 2 figures to be equal. We know there's a differential there, but it's too much at the moment. In many other sports that don't receive as much commercial sponsorship and government investment, the disparity is much closer. It's more to do with the level of commercial support that goes into tournaments and governing bodies as a whole, rather than necessarily going to individual athletes. And without that commercial support going into governing bodies as a whole, it's very difficult for them to improve the game and change it the way it's delivered for women and girls. We've seen one recent example of Investec, who are a multinational firm investing over £2 million into women and girls hockey in this country, which is the first multi-million deal purely for a women's sport, and it's fantastic. And they are doing it for genuine commercial reasons. They believe they can have a return of investment on that sponsorship because they see an innate value in women's sport.
So it turns out that actually Great Britain's got a lot of top-class female athletes. Only the Olympics have really brought this to light because we're used to talking about how Great Britain doesn't do so well with the football and Andy Murray. Do you think the Olympics are going to change the situation now? Has it propelled women into sport a lot more? Is the landscape going to be different now that after this August?
We really hope so, but we've got our severe doubts. I think it depends. The faces of the games that we've been seeing, the Jess Ennickers, the Christina Okorugus, the Rebecca Adlingtons, they have the potential to carry on and make serious names and money for themselves. However, it's the second run and the third rung of female stars that we think will probably still suffer, and it is down to the likes of the BBC ensuring that they up their coverage of women's sport and hopefully change the way that the Sports Personality of the Year show is voted on, to ensure that some of these sportswomen get the recognition that they deserve.
Who is it that nominates for Sports Personality of the Year?
27 sports editors who are all men.
Professor Evans, do you think that the London Olympics are going to change the landscape of sport for women?
I don't know, but I think they could, and I would very much like to see a very much more energy and indeed imagination put into sport in schools in this country, particularly in secondary schools, which is where a lot of girls stop playing sport of one kind and another. I think to do this with the energy that's being created by the Olympics would be a huge social asset, and it would actually also, I think, reinforce what I said previously, which is that access to sport and participation in it should be regarded as a human right, a human and indeed a human capacity which we all have, and something which it's very much in all our interests to encourage.
Mike?
Yes, I think the money and resources that flow into men's sports and to women's sports largely reflect innate gender differences. So, I mean, there is basically no problem here. So it follows that if there's no problem, there's no need to be searching around for a solution.
Professor Evans, do you agree?
No, shortly, I don't. I think solutions are needed. I think some changes are needed. And I very much hope, as I said before, that the impetus continues.
Yeah, just thinking back to when I was in school, I remember a lot of girls thinking that doing sport was just uncool. It wasn't what the cool girls did.
Exactly.
I think that's right. And in terms of innate competitiveness, we did a survey of boys and girls at school, and 42% of girls described themselves as competitive as at sporty, compared to 44% of boys. So actually the difference in this self-definition is so minimal that it's almost irrelevant. It's just the expectation that society puts on boys and girls that leads to the dropout despite that same level of competitiveness.
Mike, you're shaking your head.
Yes, I mean, really, I mean, you only have to look out in any sports field. I mean, who is it kicking a ball about? It's the boys. Really, I mean, let's just believe the evidence of our eyes.
On that note, I'm going to end today's discussion. Thank you very, very much for joining me. We were talking about sexism in sport. I was joined in the studio by Tom Woodhouse, Head of Policy at the Women's Sport and Fitness Foundation, and Mike Buchanan from the Anti-Feminism League. And over the telephone, we had Professor Mary Evans from the London School of Economics Gender Institute. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. Coming up, we have the news. And stay tuned for our Olympic report by our sports reporter, Tim Walklate.